So let's talk about the enormous power of the Tau Stormsurge, a 2-shot gun with a casual 12 damage, 4 different secondary weapon systems, and perhaps one of the best super heavies in 40k right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tau. We've been looking at a few of the datasheets from the new codex, and today we've reached the Stormsurge, the enormously powerful fire support piece that I'm sure is going to be stomping its way into several Tau army lists in the future. It really has gone from an underwhelming unit in the old book to a true force to be reckoned with in this one. In the video we'll take a look over its datasheet, talk about its expected damage output, a few of the ways to get more out of the model with buffs and synergy, and a few thoughts as to its strengths and weaknesses in game. Plenty to talk about, so let's jump on straight into it. So in the new Tau Codex, the Stormsurge is a Lord of War choice, 17 power or 330 points base, really quite cheap in terms of super heavy vehicles, but being a Lord of War really isn't an advantage. It costs you 1 command point to field one if you're not using any sept tenets or things, that would be using the super heavy auxiliary detachment, or 6 command points to field 3 in their own full super heavy detachment. The Titanic keyword does have some problems with terrain as well. It means that you can't be hiding behind obscuring things or getting dense cover most of the time. A fair few downsides there for fielding the thing, though I think its raw stats do make up for it quite well. For its profile, it's got an 8-inch move, weapon skill 5+, ballistic skill 4+, strength and toughness of 8, 22 wounds, 3 attacks, leadership 8 and a 2+ save with a 4+ invul. It's just ridiculously tankier compared with what it was. Since the previous codex is getting toughness 8, more wounds, a better save, and a better invul. Upgrades that are kind of needed for it to be strong in 9th edition, I think. Seeing as you're not going to be able to hide this thing very easily, it does need to be fairly good at taking damage if it's going to be strong. You really are going to need some high-powered anti-tank things to take this down efficiently. To remove one Stormsurge, you need something like 30-odd Space Marines with las cannons pointed at it. That invul save really does help against the vast majority of attacks. It's got a degrading profile where its ballistic skill, strength and attacks all degrade. The strength and attacks aren't really that big a concern when it's hitting on 5s anyway, but the ballistic skill dropping down to a 6+ on its lowest bracket is quite problematic. Fortunately, it does have a 1 command point stratagem to ignore the damage table if you need to. Keyword wise, it is a sept Titanic model with the vehicle keyword, Titanic being a downside as we've said, and it doesn't have the battlesuit keyword despite really quite looking like one, and that does lock it out of a few different synergies within the codex. Finally, it does have a couple of really quite useful special rules. It's got a similar rule to the Imperial Knights where it can fall back, shoot and charge, and also move over things that aren't monsters and vehicles when it does so. With only 8-inch movement, it's still not going to be able to clear all that many models though. I guess that's just a bit of insurance against it getting surrounded and locked up in combat. Otherwise though, to augment its firepower, it does have the stabilizing anchors rule. It's basically an action that it can do in the movement phase instead of moving. And it basically means that if you don't want to move the Stormsurge, then it gets to reroll all hits natively. So an absolutely massive extra damage boost if you don't need to reposition. That seems like quite a good trade-off to me, to be honest. Not moving really is quite annoying in 9th edition 40k, you're not getting it into a position where it's got better lines of sight and things, but if you can afford to stay still, the damage output is going to be massively better. Weapons wise, it has the choice between either the pulse blast cannon or pulse driver cannon. The blast cannon costs 10 points more, and to me it just seems flatly superior out of the two. Its more generalist profile is 24 inches, heavy 6, strength 12, AP -2 and damage 4. That's going to be pretty good for dealing with elite infantry, though the low AP is maybe a slight weakness. The real fear factor though is that it can fire in that concentrated fire mode at 24 inches. That's a heavy 2-shot, but goes at a mighty strength 16, AP -4 and damage 12. So if even one shot goes through armour out of those two, you've got a very good chance of just wrecking most battle tanks. I think that's typically going to be more use over the driver cannon, which is free, fires at 72 inches, has 3d3 shots at strength 10, AP -4 and damage 3. That one is a bit better against elite infantry without invul saves, but not really massively better than the blast cannon's second profile, and it doesn't have the spectacular anti-tank damage of the first. Backing that up though, the Stormsurge has 4 different secondary weapon systems. First up, some cluster rockets for some anti-infantry, 48 inches, 4d6 shots, strength 5, AP -1 and damage 1. Those ones are particularly lethal against hordes, going up to a massive 24 shots if they're targeting anything with 11+ models in. It's got 4 one-shot destroyer missiles, 72 inches, heavy 1 each, strength 12, AP -4, damage 2d3. You can only launch 2 of those per turn, so I think typically you're going to be firing 2 on the first and second turns unless you have no targets visible. You then have a flexible secondary weapon system. You can either take a twin Tau Flamer, Not a bad point defense with 11 strength 4 auto hits on average, or for 5 points you can trade it out for either a twin air-bursting fragmentation projector or twin burst cannon. I have a feeling that most people are probably going to take the twin air-bursting fragmentation projector. It better fits with the other longer range weapons of the Stormsurge, and getting a little bit of Ignore's line of sight is really quite handy on a model that's potentially really quite hindered by that. I feel like the air-bursting fragmentation projector really works quite well with the twin smart missile system that the super heavy suit also has, so that's another 8 strength 5 AP-1 damage shot that ignores cover and line of sight. Between those two you have a pretty reasonable chance of clearing out a light infantry squad even if you can't see them. Finally, if the Stormsurge does get engaged in combat, it's got thunderous footfalls, strike hit strength user AP-2 and damage 2, so basically very tiny melee threat indeed. I guess could give you a sort of reasonable chance of squishing a Space Marine in combat if you do get close. Sometimes still charging with this thing isn't actually the worst idea. You could potentially annoy an enemy unit by locking them up in combat, and then of course this thing can fall back and shoot normally, though I guess that will be at the expense of using those stabilizing anchors. Finally, the Stormsurge is also equipped with 4 different support systems. It gets a drone controller and a target lock for free. Saviour protocols will have a bit of a longer range. It'll ignore cover on all of its attacks, not just the smart missile system. And then you've got 2 different ones where you can choose which one you use. You can either have a velocity tracker for +1 to hit against fly units, or a counter-fire defense system. I honestly think that both of those are usable. +1 to hit against fly really doesn't hurt at all, though I would bear in mind unless there's -1s to hit going on, you won't be able to stack both +1 to hit with the velocity tracker and +1 with the marker light. Modifiers do cap at +1 in 9th edition. Though you'd have to weigh that up against the counter-fire defense system, which will give you the access to the 2 command point stratagem that would basically make one shot go to damage 1 before saves. I think quite a lot of the time that isn't going to be all that efficient, as you've got a good chance of saving it on your invul anyway, but it has the potential to be massively relevant against, say, other Stormsurges or Tau railguns, whenever you've got a single shot that's got truly massive damage potential. Kind of depends if you want to be a little bit more insured against other Tau, or have a more general small damage boost against fly things with modifiers. Finally, you've got the choice of either an early warning override or a multi-tracker, again both of which are free like the rest. The multi-tracker is the one that gives you the exploding 6s to hit against anything with 6 models or more in the unit, a really nice anti-horde buff for all of those secondary weapons, but the early warning override has the potential to be very powerful in Overwatch, allowing this guy to hit on 5s, so essentially another half an extra shooting phase when you're charged, and you can also fire the Overwatch stratagem for 0 CP rather than 1. Again, I can easily see you justifying both of those. I actually might be a bit more tempted by the early warning override out of the 2 there. Even if there are decent ways to mitigate Overwatch, it means that every time that it is effective, you're going to be doing some truly massive damage for essentially no extra investment. Overall, the Stormsurge is just an enormous walking gun platform, and the potential for some fairly apocalyptic anti-tank threat with that main gun and destroyer missiles, and then a whole load of other shots to mop up chaff. Moving on now, let's take a look at some damage output quickly. Here's some very rough numbers for what you might expect out of your Stormsurge, depending on whether or not it's moved. For these numbers, I have assumed that we're equipping it with a blast cannon, it's got air-bursting fragmentation projectors, and we're firing at targets within 24 inches, so both of those can be usable to their maximum effect. I'm assuming that we're doing a bit of dividing fire here. Obviously the numbers will get a bit better if you just focus all the guns on the infantry or on a vehicle. But if you do have the opportunity to go after vehicles with the big hitters and infantry with all the light guns, that's usually going to be the way to get the most value out of it. First up, assuming that the Stormsurges had to move, but you're going to be able to get a marker light on your target, the anti-tank weapons, assuming you're firing 2 destroyer missiles, do around about 17 wounds to a toughness 7 or 8 vehicle, or around about 10 wounds to a target with toughness 8, a 5+ invul and -1 damage, something a bit harder to kill like a plague burst crawler say. The average numbers are very impressive, but I would bear in mind a couple of things with that. The damage output is ridiculously swingy. That blast cannon is going to be getting wounds through in multiples of 12, so a lot of the time either a tank is going to die or it isn't. And also you do only get 2 turns of destroyer rocket fire. After that, again the damage output is going to drop. While it's doing that, with all those anti-infantry shots, on average you get about 11 dead guardsmen, or 5 or 6 wounds to a toughness 4 Space Marine. If you were focusing fire with everything though, it'd be significantly better with the Space Marines if you are firing the blast cannon and the rockets at them as well. Otherwise, if the Stormsurge has managed to get itself into a really good position, say it managed to stay still, drop anchors, and still fire to full effect with a marker light on the target, you're now averaging something along the lines of 23 wounds to a toughness 7 or 8 vehicle. That should be fairly reliable to take out the vast majority of tanks in the game, or 13 wounds to that hard target like a plague burst crawler. The anti-infantry weapons go up to 14 dead guardsmen or 7 wounds to toughness 4 space marines, and of course if you aren't able to get a marker light on your target, the stabilising anchors just add even more value. Overall, I think this is really quite respectable for the 345 points that it takes to field this version, though of course there are some downsides: swingy damage, getting line of sight, and only 24-inch range on some of the guns. It does have a few drawbacks. Moving on, let's talk about some buffs and synergy for the super suit. Probably the most obvious one are marker lights. Being a massive super heavy Lord of War, it is going to be one of the most important units to get a marker light for. A really tiny investment on that front really lead to a lot more firepower. Compared with a lot of the other Tau units, I don't feel that Montcar and Cao Yuan are actually quite as important for the Stormsurge as others, at least in terms of damage output. Being relatively slow and less manoeuvrable than some, you might struggle to get it into that effective range. I do think that the Montcar mobility is pretty important for the Stormsurge turn 1 though. I think most of the time the positioning is going to be more important than the stabilising anchors, so being able to move 8 inches plus a big D6 advance roll could easily get you lines of sight that you might not have been able to get otherwise. The damage boosts are handy situationally, of course. I feel that perhaps the Montcar one could be pretty handy for enemy infantry trying to take midfield objectives or just assail the Tau position. Extra AP and reroll ones to wounds certainly seem pretty nice for all those anti-infantry shots if the enemy squads do get too close. Sept-wise, there's a bit of a difference as to whether or not the Stormsurge is a super heavy auxiliary or in a full super heavy detachment. The auxiliary version, I believe, does not get a Sept tenet, though it still can get the Sept keyword, allowing you to use any other synergies or stratagems with it. If it's just in an auxiliary detachment, then the Sept stratagem is actually the important bit. Regardless of that though, I think that both the Borkhan and the Tau Sept are maybe standout ones for the Stormsurge. If you're fielding 3 of these big Titanic guys, it'll certainly be helpful for the 24-inch range guns to have an extra 4 inches range. Gives it a little bit of protection against strength 5 weapons, but by far the most interesting thing is that 2 command point stratagem, which allows it to ignore invul saves with 1 gun. Pretty much a match made in heaven for that pulse blast cannon. It means that your opponent's vehicles with some sort of shielding rules won't be able to make use of those when you attack. It really ups the reliability of killing hard targets with it, and to an extent perhaps doubly so. Say if you fire that massive damage 12 shot at something with a 4+ invul save, maybe your opponent saves one of them, the other one goes through, then they're almost certainly going to re-roll the failed one with a command re-roll, giving themselves another 50-50 chance of shrugging off that enormous damage 12. Borkhan's stratagem just says that they don't care about any of that, and gives you a huge chance to really easily shot most hard targets in the game. It's really not all that unlikely you could be taking down an entire Imperial Knight in a single round of shooting with that gun. Otherwise, I think that Tau Sept are one of the other most interesting ones. If you do have their Sept tenet, then a single reroll on the pulse blast cannon to hit or wound is usually going to be about as valuable as it gets. Their focus fire for +1 to wound can really help all of those secondary weapons hoover things up. And Shadowsun has the potential to use that Master of Cao Yuan Warlord trait to redeploy the Stormsurge either in your own deployment zone or into strategic reserve. Pretty cool for getting it exactly where it needs to be. I feel that the others maybe aren't quite as overwhelming. The Farsight Enclave's reroll also works well with the blast cannon. Viola can give you a bit more movement turn 1, and Sakia give you a decent survivability boost at long range with dense cover at greater than 18 inches. Otherwise, compared with most of the other units in the book, there's really not that much synergy with characters as it lacks core. Perhaps the 2 most interesting things are redeployment type shenanigans with that Master of Cao Yuan Warlord traits to redeploy 1 unit. That's just really good on a huge Lord of War like this, either keeping it safe or getting an optimal alpha strike. Or potentially you could do something gamey with a positional reroll and first turn strategic reserves. Again, could be a good way to make sure that it doesn't get hit first on low terrain boards, and hopefully gets in a position for a decent alpha strike. That does involve messing around with your commander's loadout and priorities though, which might not be the best idea. Otherwise, as a massive mighty Lord of War, stratagems are going to have about as big an effect on this as virtually any of the other units, and the Tau have a fairly handy amount of them to support the Stormsurge. First up, command rerolls are going to have a ton of value here. As with the Tau and the Farsight Enclaves, every time you reroll a hit or wound roll with the blast cannon, you're potentially adding a whole load of extra damage if that shot does get through. Those rolls are more worth it to boost shooting than most of the other targets in the game. If it is taking some exceptionally high damage shots in return as well, rerolling that 4+ invul save could save you a fair amount of hurt. Saviour protocols for nearby drones cost 1 command point. Again, if you hit with something with exceptionally high damage, the drone can just die to take the damage of the shot, and with a drone controller, that range goes out to 6 inches on this guy. For 1 CP, I think backup AI is usually going to be worth it whenever you're bracketed at all. Hitting on 5s is just fairly underwhelming, so going back up to full ballistic skill is going to be really nice for this guy. Provided you've got some decent targets, that's usually going to pay off in terms of damage output. For 1 CP, Coordinated Engagement is that one where 2 units get AP -1 against one target within 18 inches. The main trade-off though is that you do have to target literally all your guns at that unit. It kind of depends on whether or not it actually makes sense to split the firepower. It could be a bit annoying if the Stormsurge wants to fire its anti-tank guns at tanks and anti-infantry at infantry, or whether it is just literally the best solution to just fire everything into one target. For 1 CP, Shocking Firestorm could be pretty handy for targeting a non-fearless unit that you're not going to wipe out. Every casualty that you cause counts as 2 for the purpose of morale, and with this many guns it does seem like you've got a good chance of causing a fair few morale hits on the unit. At the very least, it can either cause a few casualties or force your opponent to burn their autopath stratagem in return. For 2 CP, if you did take that counterfire defense system, that's the one where you convert 1 multi-damage shot into 1 damage, but you do so before you've actually rolled the saving throw, so you didn't even necessarily know whether it matters or not. For me, that's really quite pricey for general purpose use. Maybe if you can guarantee that that move is going to save the Stormsurge for a turn rather than having it go down, or perhaps for just an enormously powerful and very reliable shot. Say if you've just been wounded by a Tau Hammerhead railgun, and it's pretty much guaranteed that you're taking mass damage. Finally, for 1 CP, we have Frequency Lock. That's the Seeker missile stratagem, and it works with the Destroyer missiles as well. They get +1 to wound against their target, and they can fire at units out of line of sight, provided that unit has a marker light on it. I guess that theoretically could be quite fun with a really fast-moving marker light platform. Maybe Pathfinders in a Devilfish or something like a Tetra. Put down a marker light on something out of line of sight, and hopefully be able to destroy it with a couple of Destroyer missiles. Maybe it could be a fun one for sniping support characters that don't have lookout surge protection and are banking on line of sight to protect them. In general, out of these, I think most of them look good. Probably I'd say the highest yield ones are just command rerolls, savior protocols, and backup AI. I'd expect all of those to be used at least semi-regularly if you are playing with Stormsurges. So where does that leave the Stormsurge overall then? In general, I feel like it's a model with just some massively impressive stats, really quite likely to win just a straight up beatdown fight against most other enemy units of its points. I think it could certainly feel like a bit of an oppressive game if someone turns up with 3 of them. Some armies are really just going to struggle to chew through that amount of very tough wounds and invul. I think perhaps in raw firepower it probably is a little bit behind buffed up broadsides or maybe even crisis suits. The core keyword just gives them a massive amount of extra options that they can deploy. So perhaps the main attraction of the Stormsurge is just mounting all of that firepower on a chassis that's really quite hard to kill without the most dedicated anti-armor fire. All of the good stuff though does come with a fair amount of weaknesses. If you are using multiple Stormsurges, you definitely have the potential to be put in a position where you can't fire with any of the direct fire weapons. Maybe good enemy fire support units hiding behind obscuring terrain and still being able to take pot shots at it without being able to get shot in return. Movement lanes can also be a bit unhelpful for this guy. It's got to go round with that massive base, and 8-inch movement isn't the fastest unless you're boosting it with Monk Car. Despite the potential for good overwatch, it's still weak in melee. It doesn't have anywhere near the same sort of mass threat as Knights do, though hopefully most of the time it can just drop back and just shoot to death whatever was engaging it. Degrading and modifiers are both issues. If you can't get a marker light, then any dense cover or -1 to hit debuffs are going to have it hitting on 5s. That's kind of a weakness of the whole Tau army in general though, not just the Stormsurge. A massive model like this can be a good place to throw debuff abilities like Psychic Powers. No core keyword limits its strength and damage ceiling, and being a Lord of War does make it a little bit unhelpful to field, either costing you loads of command points or a Sept Tenet for it. In general though, I do think that despite all these weaknesses, the raw stats still make it well worth including in an army. It does seem that at least some people are experimenting with trios of Stormsurges, maybe in Borkhan or Tau, though I certainly feel that it's a pretty strong choice just as a single threat thrown into a list. I feel like perhaps a fair bit of the counters just won't work quite as well for enemies. They can't afford to have all of their army hiding behind obscuring terrain, if that's not going to work against a lot of your other threats. In any case, I think if you are using one or multiple Stormsurges, the rest of the list does have to be pretty good at taking objectives and engaging more mobile enemies. This guy seems good for doing the heavy lifting, but it might not be enough if the opponent's able to hide or ignore him for a turn or two, and focus on destroying the best of the army and winning the objectives. So anyway, let me know what you think of the Tau Stormsurge down in the comments below. Particularly interested to hear about any practical experiences of use in game, if you've either been playing with or against one. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. I'll hopefully have a fair bit more to come for the Tau. It's going to be interesting taking a look at a few other units. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.